Welcome to Oncology Revolution, where science meets care to transform the cancer journey. We explore evidence-based strategies to enhance quality of life, promote longevity, and empower patients and professionals to thrive beyond cancer.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Raquel Maris. I'm an occupational therapist and project coordinator at the European School of Lifestyle Oncology. I'm your host, and today's guest is Toral Shah, a nutritional scientist and integrative oncology practitioner, as well as a speaker, an educator, researcher, advocate, and writer. We're also very happy to have her as a lecturer on the Advanced Certificate in Lifestyle Oncology here at our school. Thank you, Toral, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast, and I'm very excited to have joined the faculty at the European School of Lifestyle Oncology. The last few weeks I've written a lot of the lectures, so watch this space.
Well, thank you for that. It's amazing to have you. And starting from the beginning, what inspired you to work in this field?
So this conversation and this story actually goes back to when I was 11 years old, quite a precocious child, and I read a book about a cancer surgeon, and this particular surgeon worked with young people, and it talked about his experience as a clinician, but also as a parent of a child that had cancer, and it really moved me deeply. And being quite scientific, it made me think, you know what, I'm going to cure cancer, because when you're 11 years old, that is all possible. Obviously, as you get older, you realize how complex these things are. But for me, that led me onto a very natural pathway of then really going to medical school and, really working towards becoming an oncologist, because in my head, I thought that's what the right pathway was. But then life happens. My mother had breast cancer, was diagnosed out of the blue with breast cancer. She was only 49 years old. And it was a real shock to the system. So I saw her go through surgery, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, obviously not in that order, in different order, and hormone treatment. And then she just was left, and not on purpose, but that's just how it is. You have all the treatment, and then you have to rebuild yourself. But in those days, there's very little information. And I still think in mainstream medicine, there's very little information looking at nutrition and lifestyle and how you can A, support yourself through treatment, and B, reduce your risk of reoccurrence. And that's essentially what all cancer patients want. And it made me very disillusioned with A, the job of oncologist, partly because I hate needles, and I realized that hating needles and being an oncologist don't quite go together. And secondly, just really becoming interested in the nutrition and lifestyle aspect and thinking, how can I help rebuild my mum? And so from that, really leaving medicine, having a bit of a existential crisis, quite young, and then working in research for a while, and then moving into a nutritional medicine about 21 years ago, and really specializing in looking at nutrition and lifestyle in cancer and learning more about it, because we had some data, but it wasn't something that was commonly discussed. And most standard care oncology systems didn't really think about nutrition and lifestyle. And I'm glad to see that that's starting to change.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing. That's such a powerful story. Let's move into our main topic today, cultural contexts in oncology. And so my next question for you is, why does cultural context matter so deeply when it comes to health, and especially regarding lifestyle oncology?
So there's so many answers to this, but the main thing being, we as human beings are all incredibly different. Even if we're an identical twin, you're very individual, because despite your genes being like, maybe your gut microbiome may be different, maybe your lifestyle different, maybe your preferences different, maybe your home life is different. And so when we look at a one size fits all approach, it just cannot fit us as human beings, as our lives are also different. We live different lifestyles, we live in different places in the world, we have different foods that grow in those countries, we have different barriers to healthcare. And we have to remember that there are social determinants of health, meaning the environment, the politics, how much money, how much education you have, all of those things. And all of that impacts our overall health. So then when it comes back to looking at lifestyle and how we use that culturally in a cultural context, we have to understand each person's lifestyle and their cultural context. So for example, myself, no, I'm not going to jump ahead to that. So with my mum, she already worked in healthcare. So even when she was diagnosed with breast cancer, that was not her area of expertise. But she did have some understanding of how the healthcare system worked in the UK. She worked in radiology, so she understood a lot of the things about imaging and what the process was, and even things like radiation therapy. She understood those things. Now, she was also younger, but she had grown-up children, so she wasn't younger with small children. She had an incredible friends and family around her to support her through this journey. But she's also a South Asian woman who's emigrated from Africa and whose but cultural heritage is Indian. So there's definitely aspects to her genetics, her lifestyle, her exercise, all of those things that we may had to think about when it came to her recovery. Now, my mum, so South Asian women in general in the UK are the most sedentary people in the kind of demographics. My mum is not one of those people. She's always been very active, very sporty, and from being a young child, we were taken to do a lot of sports with her, and she was quite pushy when it came to that kind of thing. So for her, that was one thing that she didn't have to be convinced to do when it came to kind of recovering. She had to get obviously the mobility back, but then actually wanting to exercise, that was part of her day-to-day life. Her wanting to get healthier was also part of her day-to-day life. She didn't have necessarily the understanding of what she needed to eat, other than lots of fruits and vegetables, which is the greatest start. Like when it came to the nuances of whether she should be having more protein, at the time she was vegetarian. And because I was so passionate about this, I convinced her to start eating fish again. So these are the contexts that we had to think about. And these are just the basic context, let alone kind of some of the other things. I mean, if we take into religious things and other social contexts and people's home life and what their kind of work home life balance is and things like, my mom had a bit more balance, so she was able to do these things. Her workplace was the NHS and they gave her a full year off, so she's had that support. Whereas another person, let's think about this, and I'm just making up a person here, they might be in their like mid to late 30s, have very young children, have a job, have their partner working, have financial constraints. They might not easily be able to pick up some of these nutrition and lifestyle changes, purely for funding, purely for logistics, purely from not knowing when they can actually fit it in. There's so many different things. So we have to think about the cultural context. This isn't just about ethnicity. This is thinking, wider as to each person, and really think about personalized medicine. And if we personalize medicine, we know that we can have better outcomes.
For sure, that is so important. So, in your view, what are some common blind spots in clinical discussions around culture in oncology?
So I'm really going to talk about the UK because obviously I'm based in London in the UK, and I've done most of my education here, although I have done a lot of education training in the United States, but virtually not in person. And I understand the UK healthcare system better and the European healthcare system better than other countries. And what we need to remember is that each person has their own diet and lifestyle, but we also have to think about where this fits into the general systemic healthcare system. And so let's take somebody, and I'm gonna keep using South Asians just because I'm from that culture and I feel like I can speak best to it. If we take someone who is South Asian, who may be in their mid-50s, pre-diabetic, or maybe even has type 2 diabetes, doesn't really exercise, doesn't really know what healthy eating is, as in what they think is healthy eating may not actually be the thing, and then they are diagnosed with breast cancer, we have to give them slightly different advice to someone maybe who's, let's say, like my mum, who was doing a lot of it already. So if this person has got type 2 diabetes, first of all, we know that insulin resistance is linked with breast cancer and many other cancers too, and obesity and being overweight. So then how do we help to educate this person? What do we tell them to eat? Knowing that they may need to lose a little bit of weight, but we want them to get active while they're having their treatment to improve the outcomes. And we want them to increase that activity after their cancer treatments are ended. We want them to be eating a slightly different diet. We want them to be having maybe a lot more vegetables rather than fruits. We want them to be having more protein. We want them to be thinking about anti-inflammatory foods and really cutting down those fried foods. So that's where cultural context becomes very important. And then let's just say a younger man. In fact, this is one of my people that actually didn't become my patient, but I ended up having quite a few conversations with him. He was in his late 20s, was diagnosed with testicular cancer, was in the gym all the time, but hadn't actually gone to the doctor with his issues. And so by the time he was diagnosed, stage 4 metastatic testicular cancer, now his needs were so different. He actually lived in Scotland in quite a socially deprived area. So whilst he knew about kind of exercise and a little bit about nutrition, he was very into kind of reading up about it. He didn't have that support necessarily. He lived on his own. He already had this metastatic cancer. So what was the next thing for do? He didn't have the financials because he had to stop work. So this kind of cultural context, it becomes very different. And that's why we have to treat people very differently.
Completely. And well, thank you for sharing the stories. On the positive side, have you witnessed some examples that the outcomes really improved when there were cultural sensitivity between clinicians?
Absolutely. Although at the moment, this is not standard of care. This is kind of luck, depending on who you get assigned to be your clinicians, your oncologists, your surgeons. And so we're very lucky in the UK. We have a very mixed NHS. And if you actually look at the data, from my understanding, first of all, you're more likely to have better outcomes if you have a female surgeon, which I think is fascinating. But why is that? We don't know why. Is that because they're listening more? At the same time, I will say personally, I've had some horrible personal interactions with not great female surgeons too. So this isn't supposed to be about sexism. This is just really to understand where people are coming from. But if we look at cultural sensitivity, it's a people who are kind of taking that time to listen and understand your lifestyle. If you are taking your time as a clinician to understand, then you can make appropriate suggestions for them. So if you're going to suddenly tell someone, oh, start running marathons and they've never run, that's just not helpful, is it? But you know that they like to dance, so you can say, okay, well, go to your salsa dancing class 3 times a week instead of going once a month. Then those are the ways that cultural. And I think when it comes to the UK, we have a very big population of South Asians, Southeast Asian and East Asians, Chinese, and also Black population, whether they're from Africa, Caribbean, or African. And so we all have different foods and contexts. And then there's other, communities who may treat healthcare in a different way. For example, like Jehovah's Witnesses don't have blood transfusions and other things. So we have to be really, taking those things in mind is going to be very important. So say someone had leukemia and they from a cultural, religious context, which didn't allow, like something like a blood transfusion, you'd have to treat them very differently. So have I heard positive stories? Absolutely. Sadly, they're few and far between because this is not training that people are getting in medicine to really think about it. And it's really only the people who are looking at personalized medicine. But even then, a lot of that is in the context of a white middle class situation. And we need to start thinking about inclusion for all because, there's so many different types of people. And really, 12% of the global population is white. The rest of 88% is not white. So yeah, our medicine, it is very dependent on a Western biomedical system. So we need to start understanding other forms of wisdom, other forms of healing, other forms of, and just understanding the cultures too, as clinicians. And we're not going to know everything, everyone, but what we can do is listen to people and find out more people, and then go to those people from those communities who may be specialists, nutritionists or surgeons or things like that. For example, one of the things I'm super interested in is that people who have more melanin in their skin, i.e. black and brown people, are more likely to have keloid scarring. Now, I want to understand from surgeons, and I don't think this research is necessarily being done, but I'm sure someone somewhere is, but not, I haven't seen it necessarily, is are there different ways that you could suture to create a less keloid scarring? I'm one of those people, and that for me is very unsightly, and I've had to learn to live with that. But are there different things that we could be doing with skin? So when it comes to radiotherapy, one of my kind of good colleagues, Naman Jolka Anderson, he's doing some amazing research looking at skin sensitivities in radiotherapy of different types of skin tones. Now, no one's done that work. Why? This is 2025. This kind of work should have been done before. It's only in the pandemic that somebody, a medical student, I can't remember his name, wrote a textbook about dermatology in non-white skin, because there were no pictures in any of the dermatology textbooks which were of black and brown and Asian skin. So this is where we need to start getting better, especially as we become a global population where people live all over the world. We do need to be better at treating people.
I completely agree with you, and you touched some very important points there. So one of the most important things is avoiding one size fits all. So if you have more advices, please share it. How can we avoid, especially when evidence comes, as you said, from non-diverse populations? Do you have any more tips for us?
So from an individual basis, I think we all need to understand our own biases and do some bias training and some anti-racism training, because we all have biases. Like I caught myself the other day, actually. I was talking to someone and I said, "Oh, why did they say that? Why did he say that?" And my friend replied back, "No, it was a she." And we were talking about clinician, and it was really interesting that I was like, I'm normally very careful with those things, but yet my brain went there. If you ask someone who a doctor is, they'll assume a white man in a coat. So we all have to do it. We have our own bias, train, do our own bias training. The other main problem now is the system. The system is biased, whether we're looking at our healthcare systems. For example, we know that Black women are 5 times more likely to die in maternity settings in the UK. We know that there's been lots of kind of myths where Black people are thought to have thicker skin and handle pain better and things like that. These are all myths. These are not true, and we have to remove those from our system. And then our healthcare system, the statistics are that women of color, Black, brown, Asian women, have to go to the GP 2.3 times more to be diagnosed, to be referred to be diagnosed breast cancer in the UK. That's a problem. And then when you add into the fact that they might be young, or they might come from a socially deprived area, or any of those things, it makes it even more complex and nuanced. So we need to address these discrepancies. We have them in all our systems. It's, I know the US and the UK system best, but even in the European systems, we have amazing free social healthcare, but there are issues within that where some people believe more than others. The other thing is, a lot of medicine is based on white men. 51% of the population are not white, are not men, they're women. And so there's a lot of research that we know is missing. Women's health, it has only the 20th of the research that men's health has. And so we're already seeing, forget the cancer context, and forget even ethnicity, the differences between men and women are vast in how much our bodies are understood. I mean, even the menopause conversation, it happens to 100% of all women. Yet it's only been research and study in the last few years. No one's really talked about it, despite it happening to every single woman in the whole world.
For sure, those are such important points, and there's still a lot to be done, and a long way to go regarding inclusivity and equality. But touching now another point, which is the environment. So we have talked about the context, but the context is also environment. What role does the environment play in the development of cancer?
So there's different aspects of the environment we can talk about. So we can talk about our kind of environment when it comes to food around us. We can talk about air pollution, all of those different things. We can talk about our water. But when it comes to food, there was a really interesting piece of research where it kind of looked at it was something to do with looking at how likely you are to eat healthily, or whether, and then they looked at children on the way home from high school, not primary school. They often come home by themselves. How many fried chicken shops were there on the way home. And the areas where there are very few, people generally had, healthier eating things, and the ones which didn't. And now what's interesting is when there's social deprivation, you're more likely to have these fast food outlets and chicken shops. In fact, I was at an event last night, and I was talking to a woman that I met. I don't even know how we started talking about the difference between North London and South London. And this is both London. And she said she'd never heard of something called Morley's London. Morley's is a fried chicken shop in South London. It's everywhere, like literally everywhere. And she lived in North London. They have a very different population. And it was I think it was like a Jewish bagel shop that we were talking about. And it was such an interesting thing that just in different areas you can have different food. And what's the access then to fresh fruit and vegetables? Because there's some areas where there's food deserts, where there's only access to like kind of processed, ultra processed foods, and the access to fresh fruit and vegetables is very difficult or very expensive. So I live in a very interesting area. It's a borough called Southwark. It's very, very mixed in multiple ways, socioeconomically, ethnicity, all sorts of things. And very expensive housing, very poor house, all of them. And it's really interesting to kind of view the difference there. But what's interesting about this area is there are quite a lot of local markets, whether it's kind of more ethnicity led or whether it's just fruit and vegetable markets. And I think that makes a difference. That if there's a local market where you can just buy these bowls of fruit and vegetables for £1 or €1 or whatever it is, then that's going to give you, and then you have to have also the space to cook, the utensils, the space to store food. So if people, let's say, are living in social housing, they only have, 1 or 2 bedrooms and like a very small kitchen, and they have nowhere to store, they can't buy big bags of things which are cheaper. So for someone like my mum, who lives in a big house, our family home, she has plenty of space to buy big bags of rice and whatever it is. Like, in fact, she's always buying stuff. So whenever I need something, I'm like, Mum, can you give me some peppercorns? Because I know she buys big packs. Whereas for someone like me, I live in the city, and I, socioeconomically at the higher end, I don't have that space still to store these big packs of things. So of course that's going to make a difference to people's kind of eating habits and their environment. And then the next thing is, and again, I'm talking about London just because it's good to illustrate. Where I live, there are lots of parks, but I am definitely near one of the busiest roads in London where there's probably the most air pollution. We know from some of the research, particularly in France, that these carbon particles and stuff, all of this can potentially contribute to breast cancer risk. So there's all these things. So for me personally, I have that information. I utilize it, and I sleep with a HEPA filter. But not everyone has that information or knows that. And, of course, they can't always close their windows. They can't always have access to being in the fresh air. So whilst we have loads of parks in this area, it's fantastic because everyone lives in apartments. Maybe the air isn't always as fresh, who knows? So this is something that it does make a difference to people's cancer risk. People who have access to nature. Yeah, parks are not the same as being out in kind of forest or a big kind of field or things like that. So that's going to impact your kind of a lifestyle and your disease risk. Forget, not just cancer. So all of these things make a difference. And then our water in the UK, who knows what's going on with our water? But basically, we know that a lot of our rivers and lakes are polluted. So even if you wanted to go for an outdoor swim, you probably couldn't, because it'd probably be very, very dangerous for you. And then obviously we have got the water companies do clean the water, but so many people now use extra kind of filters because there's a lot of, like, if you've had chemotherapy, all of that stuff goes in the water. The sheer volume of estrogens and hormones in our water, because so many people are taking, the birth control and things like that. It does, that all of that can impact your risk.
For sure. Thank you for pointing that out. How do you think we could design more inclusive nutrition and lifestyle plans that respect people's identities and realities?
That's a great question. I think the first thing is we have to design more livable cities. So actually, when I think about some areas in London, they're great because they're walkable. You can walk to fruit and vegetable shops. You can walk to fruit and vegetable markets. You can easily find ethnic foods. You can find lots of different things. And in other places, you can't find any of these things. So realistically, we want to create walkable cities, not cities where you need to do everything by car. We know that having more walkable cities means that people actually move more. We also know that they're more likely to access those services, and having like access to things like leisure activities, which are sports and things. For example, my council, Southwark, actually do quite a good job of that. So all the parks have got like play areas or exercise areas. We have tennis courts, and until about the pandemic, those tennis courts were free to use, which was insane until, which is like 2020. You do have to pay for them now, but it's not horrible. And the tennis lessons they share are actually very affordable. So what's been interesting for me as someone who has played tennis and has come back to it is that the coaches are all different ethnicities, but also the people in my classes are all different. It's just tennis in the UK has been quite a white sport. So because people haven't had access to it. So I think there's a real importance to people who are doing the town planning, to governments, to kind of local organizations banding together to create cities which are more health focused. If you look at the blue zones data and some of the blue zones work, where they're looking at areas where people are more likely to live over 100 and be centenarians, the blue zones have actually gone into a few cities in the US where it was all car driven, ultra processed foods, all of those things, and they've actually change the planning of the towns to make it more walkable, to make more access to fruit and vegetables and leisure activities. And the health metrics of those towns have improved. Now, can we go back and retroactive to do that, especially not in Europe where we've got cities which are developed over thousands of years ago? But are there definitely ways that we could create things? So getting rid of youth activities, that's a problem. Getting rid of our kind of council-led, our governmental-led leisure activity, that's a problem. Getting rid of teaching cooking and nutrition at school, that's a problem. We need to be giving these things, and yet we live in this highly individualistic societies, rather than if we invested in our communities and our collective care, we would have much better health outcomes. And this is all linked to capitalism and patriarchy and white supremacy and all of those things.
For sure. And we have talked about culture and environment, but one thing that you actually touched, and that can really create a change, is the area of education. So, in your view, what role does training play in helping professionals deliver care that respects diversity? And also, what are some gaps that are most oftenly seen among clinicians?
So I think the first thing is that at medical schools generally around the world, no, I'm going to change that. But generally medical schools in UK, Europe, and the US and Canada, Australia, even, you're not really learning about nutrition. When I went to medical school 25 years ago this year, which shows my age, we had 5 lectures. That's not changed. There are some universities which have really taken up and changed that. And these are some of the new universities, and University of Bristol. And if you're like, for example, one of my friends, Dr. Geeta Maker-Clark, she's at the University of Chicago. She's introduced this whole culinary medicine and nutritional medicine into the medical school curriculum. But those medical schools, it's not there for everybody. And I think we need to change that. Nutrition lifestyle has to be embedded into medical school and any healthcare professional training, because we need preventative healthcare. But I think we need to go before that. We need to be teaching this stuff to children at primary school, middle school, high school, senior school, and teach them the importance of nutrition and lifestyle, and not just do PE, which everyone hates, but do active things that people can sustain for the rest of their life. I hated PE at school. And I did a lot of sports outside of school, which I really loved. But at school, the PE, the physical activity education, really focused on those people who are really sporty, and that was it. And everyone else was not, it was rubbish. And it was just really about running and netball and maybe a little bit of tennis. It was terrible. Whereas I did, tried things outside school. That's because my mum was really into it. I had swimming lessons, and I did ballet, and I did modern and tap, and I did badminton, and I did tennis, and my parents could afford to do that, but also more importantly, they sacrificed things so they could prioritize giving us those opportunities. Now, not everyone can do that, and I think we have to use school to give people skills that they can live it as adults. I would say that 95% of things I left at school, I've never used it ever again. And what we need to teach them is people how to budget, how to cook, how to look after their health, and not how to understand what they need to do, how to pay their taxes. This is the education that we would actually help to have a healthier society globally. And then when it comes to medical school, embed in nutrition and lifestyle and the preventative, along with what to do alongside with treatment and management of certain lifestyle conditions, including cancer. And after that, any specialist training, this needs to be a prerequisite. So this European School of Lifestyle Oncology and the training that was advanced certificate we're giving to anyone who undertakes the training, obviously, who anyone who's related to the cancer field, so important. And, we are going to start to see amazing projects come out where, people are using exercise oncology. I mean, one of your previous podcast guests, Professor Robert Newton, friend of mine, he's using exercise in a really practical way with his patients. In Australia, he's had this clinic set up for over 20 years where it's part and parcel of the treatment. Alongside chemotherapy and radiotherapy, you have your personal training sessions before these sessions. And that has massively shown to reduce the side effects and to improve outcomes.
Sure. And thank you for pointing out our advanced certificate in lifestyle oncology. We are very excited for the second edition, which is coming up very soon. And we have been having such great feedback from first edition and also seen an increasing in the interest on this topic. But one thing I would like to ask you is, do you think the growing interest that we see right now in integrative care is enough?
It's a starting point. And, what we need is somewhere to start from. There is definitely a growing interest in integrative oncology and more integrative medicine, actually. We have to treat the patients, the people that happen to have cancer. We don't treat the cancer. When you treat just the cancer, it becomes a one size fits all. This becomes more personalized when you're actually looking at the person whole holistically. You're looking at their kind of standard of care treatment. You're looking at kind of the nutrition, the lifestyle, all of those things. But then you're also looking at the mind and body spirit things, because you don't go through cancer and you're not affected mentally and that doesn't impact your care. Of course it does. All of these things are really important. Plus, as we talked about at the very beginning, that there's all these amazing things that we can learn from yoga, acupuncture, traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurveda. This is ancient wisdom, scientific wisdom. And we haven't used this in the Western world, despite there being loads of data and evidence, because everything doesn't much research, even though we know it works. And why is that? Because we're really focused on this Western biochemical model. And actually, some of the issues are that we're taking those things from these cultures and we're culturally appropriating them. Like, so for example, pranayama is breath work, but we've renamed it breath work. Why can't we just call it pranayama? Even things like the hot and cold therapies, we're using saunas and temazcal and other things. These are things that people have been doing for thousands of years, and yet we're only just coming to it. But it does make a difference. You having your soul tended to, having your mind, your heart supported through treatment makes a difference. And I really do want to share my personal story too, if that's okay. So one of the things I didn't share before was, I have a very personal connection to cancer. I was diagnosed with breast cancer at age 29. I'd just finished my master's in nutritional medicine, also finishing rather my master's in nutritional medicine, and I found a lump and I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And, obviously it was very, very early stages, mostly DCIS, but so it means trapped in the milk ducts, but it it really impacted my life and how I felt about my body and how I felt. And it sent me on a lifelong journey of personal and spiritual development and growth. And that's why I really think that these are the things that I may not have come to until maybe now, but I came to them very early in age because I had that experience. And I realized that if I didn't deal with some of the stress I'd have in my body or some of the trauma or any of the other things, I wasn't going to be able to fully heal. I had a very bad breakup in the sort of 18 months before I was diagnosed with cancer. And when I talk to younger women who've had breast cancer, they've all had some sort of trauma within that 18 months to 2 years. Like, how do we now scientifically prove that? And how do we sort of manage that? We don't, but we do have to help them because it's very difficult, help us rather, because it is very difficult to go through a cancer diagnosis. So answering that with the integrative oncology, if we can, integrative really oncology looks at taking those three things, the standard kind of treatment of care, taking the nutrition and lifestyle, but also those mind, body, spirit practices, and bring it together, treating people holistically as a whole human being who has cancer rather than treating the cancer. We're going to have better outcomes because we're going to be able to personalize care. And that doesn't mean that we have to make it, obviously, in an ideal world, we'd genomically test everyone and we'd individually change our diets. But with what we have, even with our own current systems, we can definitely start to make a difference by actually listening. So, for example, one of the things is I had to change oncologist halfway through. I've had 2 local reoccurrences since. And because I wanted someone who's actually listening to me, it wasn't just saying, no, we need to do this hormone treatment in this way because this is what the data shows, this is what the statistics. I'm like, yeah, but that's for everybody. That's not for me. We need to work at what works for me. I can't live like this if I'm doing this and I'm having these side effects. So that's why I think integrative oncology in the end is going to be so much more successful, because people are going to be more likely to adhere to treatment, particularly things like hormone treatment, which go on for years and years and years, when they felt listened to and heard to, and they're being helped, their side effects are being managed. The statistics are that I know that over 50% people don't complete hormone treatment with breast cancer because of the side effects, and they just don't even tell their their clinicians, because they're not being managed from the side effects. So this is where I think if we start this more integrative process, then hopefully we'll have better outcomes.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your personal story. It's very inspiring. And I think it shows the power of self-efficacy, actually, right? So I would like to ask you more personally also, so if you feel comfortable speaking about it, was it difficult for you to have a diagnosis so early at age? So do you think when you are so young, getting a diagnosis is more difficult to deal with than when you will be older, maybe?
I can't say whether it's more or less difficult, but what I can share is at that age, very few people understand what it feels like. When people are being diagnosed, even at my mum's age at 49, a few people understood. But when you're being diagnosed at 50, 60, 70, there's way more people in your social network that may have had that experience, so they may understand you. When you're 29 years old, you're just starting adult life, and I felt very isolated. This is pre-social media. I think social media has made a huge difference to that, so people can connect in that way. And I think younger people, sadly, we have had an increase in younger cases of particularly breast cancer, but other cancers too, and they're able to connect now on social media. And I think that means that people use it a lot more and they feel less alone. But I didn't really have anybody. I didn't have anyone to talk to who understood what I was going through. And I was very, very lucky, because about 6 to 8 months after I was diagnosed, I found this organization, which sadly doesn't exist anymore. It's called Breast Cancer Haven, and now it's actually kind of run by Future Dreams. And they're a younger women's support group. And I went to that younger women's support, and I actually met other people. Even in that group, I was one of the youngest. And I met other young women who'd had breast cancer. And there were also people of different ethnicities as well, which was, because it was London, I was so lucky. And that actually was a place where I felt safe and I could share something. Then we talked about all sorts of things like dating and eyebrows and sex and, financials. People don't realize that when you're diagnosed with breast cancer young, this impacts your finances for a very long time. For example, I couldn't get a mortgage on my own because I couldn't get life insurance unless I had somebody who's a guarantor on my. So, and again, that means that may price some people out of getting a home by themselves. And luckily, my dad was able to support me. But these are the kind of things that people don't think about. It affects your fertility, affects your body confidence. I had a mastectomy. I've had no breast or no nipple for like 20 something years. Well, not quite so long, but you know what I mean. Quite a long time. And it affects your shape and your scars. And so dating and meeting someone, then you think about you're taking these things like tamoxifen or, other drugs that block your ovaries, or ovary suppression stuff, and then your sex drive, your kind of fertility, all of those things. And it is really hard. I'm not saying it's harder because I can't compare it, because I was so young. But when my mum and I speak about it, she says she found it harder to watch me going through cancer than going through it herself. And so I find that really interesting. And I think also for her, at her age, at 49, a lot of her friends were married and had grown-up children, like children in their early 20s. They weren't small. I, in my late 40s, have a lot of my friends have had children so even as late as age 45, that they're still dealing with very small children. You know, a lot of my friends still have children under the age of 5. So they just don't have the capacity to support. You know, when I had breast cancer again in the pandemic, everyone was dealing with their own, excuse my language, shit, because we were in the pandemic, we were all in lockdown, no one knew what was going on. People were worried about their finances, people were worried about their children, they're worried about their parents. No one had capacity to support me. So it's not just your age, I think it's your social kind of where you are in the world. And I think being single is quite hard and having cancer.
Well, that was a very touching story, and thank you so much for opening up, for being so honest. I feel like it's going to be very helpful also for our listeners, maybe younger ones, or maybe family that has younger people who is going through this journey. It's always nice to feel that we are not alone. So I'm very sorry to hear that you felt lonely, but also that you had your family to support you. That is very nice. So I wanted to ask you if you would have any advice for someone who is listening and want to become advocates themselves for lifestyle medicine. What would you say?
So, firstly, thank you so much. I'm really happy to share, and thank you for creating that safe space. I think if they want to advocate for healthy lifestyle, there's different. If you're a clinician, please go and learn about lifestyle medicine. And obviously, different country, there's lots of different qualifications. If you're in oncology, obviously this, our course is excellent, the SLO course, but even if you work in like cardiology or diabetes or anything like that, if you think about cardiology or cardio oncology, let's say, to bring it back to oncology, there are lots and lots of ethnicities where they're more likely to have genetic mutations which can impact them if they're having chemotherapy. So even some standard chemotherapies like EF or whatever there might be, that can impact people's heart. So we should be looking at people's cardiovascular history, their family history of cardiovascular events, and then we should be genomically testing these people to see what their risk is. I have a friend who family had heart disease, but no one asked her, and she had chemotherapy, and it's meant it's damaged her cardiovascular function. She has a heart ejection fraction of under kind of 40. It impacts her day-to-day life. She wasn't able to safely get pregnant and carry a baby because of that impact on her heart. So, and this is somebody who's younger in their 30s. So we have to really think about all of those things. And so my request is first go and do some anti-bias, anti-racism training and understand the issues within our systemic healthcare. And then secondly, go and have some sort of lifestyle education. There's so many things. And for oncology, obviously we've got this course, but there's also there's functional medicine, there's, the Metabolic Terrain Institute of Health, exercise oncology, there's, the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine. There's so many different things, but we need to, obviously, the onus is on the clinician. It's not provided as part of your training. Unfortunately, the onus is on the clinician to go and do their own training to pay for it themselves. This is not included. And they've already spent thousands and hundreds of pounds, dollars, euros in their training already. And what we really need to do is start including it in our kind of training, our actual kind of healthcare professional training. But there is lots out there now. And just reading books, following podcasts like this. There's so many. Yeah, I love other podcasts like this is very specific to, oncology, but even things like Peter Attia, love. It's very scientific, so it may not be for our patient advocates, but it's definitely there for other people. And then even things like, Rangan Chatterjee in the UK, like he does a beautiful podcast about healthy lifestyle. He looks at like the more mind, body, spiritual. So I think there's lots of information, but it's about finding that time and having that interest. And then how do you then sift through that information to know what's right for you or what's actually scientifically correct? And I think that's the complex part that we have now, that we just don't have any standards in this because it's been so separate from traditional conventional medicine, and that's where the problem lies.
Yeah, but it does have to change because it makes such a difference. So it's very nice to see that more and more programs are out there, and this is been an interest for more people. And that's also our goal in the school to have to create the opportunity for the healthcare professionals to have this kind of knowledge in lifestyle medicine regarding oncology. So, as we are reaching to the end of our podcast, I would like to ask you if you have one final message for our audience.
So I guess my first thing is we all will get older, but we want to live until we have there's a difference between health span and lifespan, and we want to really live as healthy as possible for as long as possible. That does mean that you have to invest in your health, whether you're an individual or a clinician. You have to go and you have to walk the walk and talk the talk. Sometimes when I'm doing my research meetings, I'm sitting on my spinning bike, and I'm doing the meeting because I'm like walking the walk, talking the talk. And they used to find it really weird before, but now people have got used to it. I'm like, listen, I do research in nutrition and exercise and breast cancer and prostate cancer. I'm going to show you how it's done because I've also had breast cancer myself. So that's what I will say. But I also think there's something about there's economic differences too. If you can be preventative as a person or a clinician, you're going to save so much money in the long run. So let's start focusing on preventative healthcare. That is my final message.
Well, thank you so much, Toral, and thank you for sharing all your knowledge and your perspective with us today. This conversation has highlighted just how important it is to look at oncology through culture, environment, inclusivity, and also be yourself advocate. So thank you so much.
You're so welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure.